Good evening. Good evening. You're not. I think you're clapping for the wrong person. Welcome to the Bexley Public Library. I'm Jim Wilson. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees here at the library, and we are delighted and grateful to have all of you here with us tonight. Not only to enjoy the fourth author talk in our 2024 Centennial Author Series, but to help us honor the life, work, and legacy of the great James Baldwin. We're especially pleased to be celebrating what would also be Mr. Baldwin's 100th birthday. Our library's centennial celebration continues after tonight, so you can join us next Friday, September 6th, for our big birthday bash and national road car show. We'll have birthday cake, Johnson's ice cream, food trucks, and more. And we invite you back once more to celebrate our Centennial Author Series finale on Thursday, September 26th, with celebrated local authors Maggie Smith and Saeed Jones. Mark your calendars also for the many other fall programs here at our library. All of them are listed online and in the fall program guides that you can find in the back of the room and throughout the library. Before we get started, I would like to say a special thanks to our benefactors and lead sponsors who made this entire series possible. Annie and Tim Bebejisenko, I probably messed that up, but they're out of the country now, so I think I'm safe. Beth Crane and Richard McKee, the Crane Group, the Friends of the Bexley Public Library, Giuseppe's, Frank and Linda Cass, the Teagle Foundation, and the Bexley Whitehall Rotary Foundation. There are so many more people, businesses, and organizations that also have made this evening possible. I'd urge you to check out the full list of sponsors and let them know how much you appreciate their support, in part so that they'll support the next series that we do. Of course, Gramercy Books, which has been a great partner with us, is here tonight. If you have not done so already, please visit them for book purchases before the book signing following tonight's event. Tonight, we are lucky enough to be joined by two inspiring and celebrated Ohio authors who have been profoundly influenced by the life, activism, and writing of James Baldwin. To give you some insight into the wonderful program, how this wonderful program came together, and to introduce our authors, I'd like to turn things over to Zach Parrish, who's one of our many great staff members here at the library and our director of our programming librarian.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm just going to share really quickly how tonight came to be. As Jim mentioned, it is our centennial year here at the Bexley Public Library. So planning began way back, probably last spring of 2023. And so when we were initially planning on how to celebrate our centennial, we started Googling what else was happening in 1924. And when we saw, James Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem, we knew that we wanted to plan something to celebrate the profound writing and the life of the iconic writer and activist James Baldwin. And when thinking about who might be a good fit, Prince Shakur's name was the first that was thrown out. So I was able to do some reconnaissance, and I went and saw Prince speak at the Columbus Book Festival last summer, and he was incredible. And so while waiting in the line to get my book signed, I just mentioned, hey, I work at the Bexley Public Library. We're interested in planning an event to celebrate James Baldwin at 100, and Prince enthusiastically said, oh, that sounds incredible. I'd love to be involved. But, it was a signing line, so he's probably saying that to get to the next person in line. So I was very happy when he replied to my follow-up email, and he excitedly suggested Quartez Harris for a conversation partner. And Quartez happened to be writing a picture book biography on how James Baldwin became a writer. So it was a perfect fit, and now we're here tonight. Prince Shakur is a queer Jamaican-American author, freelance journalist, videomaker, and grassroots organizer. His writing has been featured in Teen Vogue, Catapult, Level, Electric Lit, and more. He has been the proud writer-in-residence at Sangam House, 12 Literary Arts, the Studios of Key West, and La Maison Baldwin. His memoir, When They Tell You to Be Good, appeared on many 2022 Best Of lists, was called A Scorching Nonlinear Journey Through a Black Man's Search for Self by Kirkus Reviews, and won the Hurston Wright Crossover Award, honoring provocative and original new voices in literary nonfiction. Yes, give it up for Prince Shakur. Quartez Harris is a poet, teacher, and author. Harris is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Nothing But Skin and We Made It to School Alive, which was called A Brilliant Force for the Uplift of Young Black Folks and the People Who Love Them by Columbus's own Hanif Abdurraqib. He was named Ohio Poetry Association's Poet of the Year in 2021 and was the 2020 Baldwin House Fellow. He spent many years as a second-grade teacher in the Cleveland Public School System and currently spends his time writing and teaching poetry workshops. Harris's upcoming book, Go Tell It, How James Baldwin Became a Writer, is an ode to the legendary writer and the power of the written word. It is due out in January 2025. It is available for pre-order through Gramercy Books in the back, and has already been named a recommended read by School Library Journal. Please join me in welcoming Prince Shakur and Quartez Harris.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear
Hello?
me? Can you hear us? Okay, great. Before we get started, I have to just share a quick story. So me and my wife, we commuted here this morning. We checked into a hotel. He inquired about why we're here. And I said, I will be in conversation with my dear friend Prince. And his response was, so who are you having a conversation with? And I said, just casual. I said, just James Baldwin. He said, he's always relevant. I was like, in a hotel. So I just had to share that information.
Thank you everyone for being here. I guess I just kind of want to orient us in this space and just remind people that this year, August 2nd, was James Baldwin's 100th birthday. So I think that deserves a round of applause. And yeah, I mean, I feel like this will just be a pretty open-ended conversation, but should we tell people how we met?
How we met, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess for me, 2 years ago, I did an artist residency in south of France. For those that don't know, James Baldwin went to Paris/France for the first time when he was 24 in 1948. And a few years ago, I mean, I've traveled to Europe a few times over the last number of years, but 2 years ago, I decided to do a residency called La Maison Baldwin. That was in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, where James Baldwin lived for the last number of years of his life and passed away. And I was there, and there was like a conference happening that month, and I met another Clevelander, another writer, other writers. And now we're here. So I think that just kind of shows you, because at least for me, I went to France for the first time when I was 21 in 2015, and I went there because of James Baldwin, because I had just been learning about him, because he, I don't know, ran away or escaped or went to another place to figure out if he could be more than just a black person or more than just whatever this country feels that he is. He wanted to see if he could be a writer, and I feel like he's inspired that journey in so many people, and that's like kind of how we met. And so I feel like maybe just my first question for you is, how did you first learn about Baldwin? When did you first learn about Baldwin? What was your perspective on him then, and how has it changed over time? Which I imagine it probably has, obviously, since your book out in January is about him.
You can clap for that. You can clap for that. First, before I respond to that specific question, I do want to kind of give you a sense of sort of how the book is realized. So, and I know that as a former second grade teacher, I recognized that there were no picture book biographies on James Baldwin. You had picture books on Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, Soldier of Truth, Ruby Bridges. And I felt like knowing that Baldwin's childhood was central to his canon of work, I felt like this is critical text for my kids to be able to sort of like know what's possible for the possibilities of language, but also be able to know who their literary hero is, even though they don't know who this literary giant is. And so I wrote a picture book biography. I knew that Baldwin used poetry to work out his prose. So it's a lyrical tribute to the life and legacy of James Baldwin. I specifically chose to focus on James Baldwin's childhood because I always felt that Baldwin was always talking to the child that's cloaked within the adult. So that's why, I always imagine there's two Baldwins. There's Baldwin the child and there's Baldwin the adult, right? And Baldwin's always talking about children. Baldwin has a deeply felt commitment and care to children. So I definitely want to just highlight that. In terms of how my entry point or my path to Baldwin, it's a little complicated. So I was raised in a Pentecostal church. And I remember there were moments where I felt a bit unsettled with sort of the rigid divide between the world and the church. And although Baldwin was raised in a church, he openly critiqued not Christianity itself, but the institution of Christianity. But what he did, what I thought was very fascinating, is he talked about the political possibilities for the disenfranchised. He focused on sort of social political issues, right? It was almost like he didn't abandon the world. So I felt like I have a deep care for the world, and there was a sense that I felt like if you were not in a church, you were sort of alienated. And I felt like Baldwin's sensitivity to the world, to humanity, for me, it was just like, oh, wow, he's really helping me to understand or think through social political issues. He's helping me to understand the complicated nature of humanity. So I read Go Tell It, and that just changed my life. And at that point, I became a voracious reader. I read everything Baldwin has ever written. And yeah, so that's what led me to sort of like, I have to write. There's my declaration of sort of care for Baldwin has to come out through children because most of my life, my work has been spent with working with children.
Yeah. And what do you feel like, could you talk more about what you feel like Baldwin has to offer to children or younger people? Because I guess for me, it's seemingly a complicated question, but not so much because a lot of what his fiction is about is very serious, very dark, very intense. Even though Baldwin also did make a children's book as well, isn't that right? And so I guess I wonder, like, what is your perspective on generally what Baldwin can offer to like younger folks, children, and what you kind of hope your book is kind of opening up in terms of that conversation?
I'm actually prepared to answer this question. So in order for me to answer that, I have to talk about the literary history of children's lit. So it started with Brown Book, which was sort of published through the Crisis. As we know, it was the official magazine for the NAACP. And the Crisis was really the first text that sort of like the origin text for children's literature, African-American literature. But a lot of these texts at that time, and that was published I think the Crisis was in 1920. And so that's like the origin story of like children's literature. But a lot of these texts, they sort of had a positive representation of the Black experience. Baldwin did something that was considered like a counter narrative. So what Baldwin did with Little Man, it came out and it was published in 1971. And believe it or not, this book sort of became the footnote to sort of Baldwin's storied legacy. It lives right now as sort of like the in the margins of like African-American literature for children. But what happened was Baldwin was in that book, he labeled it as a book for children, a book written for children but for adults. But Little Man, it addressed social political issues. It addressed the unrelenting brutality of policing. It addressed racism. It addressed non-normative expressions right? It addressed all of these social ills, which books at that time were not doing, and it quietly went out of print. And that was a book that Baldwin deeply cared about. So I feel like my book is in homage of sort of that lost text, right? And I think that because and Baldwin ultimately wrote that in response to his nephew, said, write a book about me, right? And again, we know that Baldwin had a vulnerable childhood. So I felt like for me to write a book, I want to be in tribute to that tradition, in tribute to sort of Baldwin's sense of care for children, but also be in tribute to sort of Baldwin not having sort of the recognition he wanted for his children's book, Little Man, Little Man. So I feel like my book is sort of part of that continuation of just really highlighting sort of the love and passion that Baldwin had for young people.
Yeah, and I feel like what I sense in that is a sort of, I don't know, like a part two to what I imagine some of his goals were in his children's book. I imagine some of that is continued in what you're doing, and I also see it kind of as a conversation, because I do agree with you in the sense that Baldwin does write a lot towards younger folks or kind of his younger self. And I think especially of like his letter to his nephew, in that a lot of what he's trying to offer is kind of, I think like, I know the world is ugly, I know it's a messed up place. Here are the dangers of allowing this world to change you, or to change us, or to change our people, and kind of offering a sort of blueprint, which I think is amazing, because since he's both, I think now he's kind of having a reemergence in a lot of ways, and I'm kind of writing about this a lot now, like the beauty of how his star's kind of risen again, and also some of the dangers of that. But even in my life, I can look at Baldwin and, I don't know, I think about the fact that I started writing when I was 12 or 13, and I didn't really discover Baldwin in a classroom until my junior year of college, maybe. And I think about all of the reasons for that, about Baldwin's placement in like the civil rights and Black Power movement. I think about his sexuality. I think about his approach to international politics, his ability to push back against the white moderate or the white establishment, and how his positionality towards that changed. And if I'm thinking of all of the lessons that he offered, and if that was taught in a classroom across the US, and obviously right now a lot of literature is being peeled back from classrooms, but I think about how transformative that would be to so many different kinds of children, and how, I don't know, I mean, I guess like the easiest way I could put it is like, I think he's not taught in the classrooms because there's a lot of homophobia and like stigma around even addressing, looking at queerness through like a historical lens, and how I think we're definitely in a period of time where that's being questioned. Fascism is on the rise, censorship is on the rise, DEI, and I don't know, anything related to like a marginalized history is kind of at risk. And so maybe this is also kind of a big question, but I guess entering this space of publishing this book in the children's literature space, I guess, what are your perspectives, or have you thought much about like if you feel like there might be some pushback on the book, or how you're kind of orienting or thinking about bringing it into the world in the political moment that we're kind of in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. I said, Little Man would have been banned, now with the censorship legislation. I've said this before on some platforms I spoke on, is that when you ban books, you banish children. And something I'm thinking about now is in sort of like the reaction to sort of Baldwin. And it's so funny, because when my book went up for auction, a lot of the editors sort of like, how are you going to handle sort of his queerness? Literally, I mean, it was very much like a more careful sort of approach to like, can we make sure we're careful? And it's like before they wanted to sort of adopt the book, they wanted to know like what was my position on how I plan to like sort of address his queerness, his queer identity. Don't be too explicit, and my editors wrestled with that. So I've sort of wondered like, so what is going to be the reaction when Baldwin when this book comes out, because I definitely don't shy away from his sort of his queer identity, his non-normative gender expressions, and it's particularly highlighted in the back matter also. But you know, I do have a question for you though. We've been talking about how like Baldwin is not being, I mean, he's at the margins in terms of, you know, his literature being taught in classrooms. And what do you think young people can discover in Baldwin? What can they decide about themselves?
I think there's a lot. I mean, a bunch of things come to mind, but I think of how important and beautiful it is for young people to see people that have difficult childhoods or backgrounds go out into the world, experience the world, clash against different cultures, be changed by the world. And I especially mean that as like a Black person that also grew up in Cleveland, like in the inner city, and how when I was younger, there were only so many visions of a future my environment could offer me. And so I think even having someone who's older than you, who's, I don't know, has like a zeal for life, and how, I don't know, I guess I could put it this way. Sometimes when you're a child and you look at adults, you think adulthood doesn't look very fun. I think Baldwin also
pretty much.
made adulthood look exciting and interesting, and he took
did.
chances. And I mean, I feel like in similar ways when I travel to certain places, like sometimes I go somewhere and I'm like, why am I here? Has a Black person ever been here? And I feel like he opens up that possibility for other people to go off into strange and interesting places. And then I also just think in terms of, I don't know if I could, like I haven't taught younger folks like extensively, but I also think about like the internet, attention spans, our ability to engage, to especially have media literacy, social media literacy, mainstream media literacy. And I think using Baldwin as an example of how to look at the world, to look at media, to look at political systems, and to break them down on a critical thinking level. And I think, of course, the way he writes can be seemingly very complicated and also beautiful and intense. But I think if we built a culture where young people's minds are respected and they're challenged around his literature, it would open up a lot of critical thinking and justifiable rage around the systems that we're currently experiencing. And then I just think on like kind of what we're just speaking about, I think in terms of literature and school and sexuality, I know for me in school, nothing about LGBTQIA life or history was ever really taught, highlighted, instructed in any meaningful way, like at all. And I know that is changing based on where you are, or your school or your administration, but I also think to insert Baldwin into like regular curriculum, I think would challenge a lot of people, open a lot of minds. And I think on another level, if I'm kind of speaking to like how he analyzes and looks at identity, I think he encourages a kind of deeper humanism. And I think all of those things are needed, especially for younger people, where the internet is where most or a lot of people learn about politics. And I think that can be great, but it's also like a lot of data mining and rage farming, and how can we know if those conversations are as genuine as the conversations Baldwin might have had at his welcome table or in his dining room or at one of the many restaurants he frequented in New York. And so I think it's a very big thing that he could offer, and that's exactly why he hasn't been offered more, because I think that would scare a lot of the elite.
And Prince made a comment about Baldwin made adulthood look almost like charming in a sense, like inventive. And I remember when we went to South France, we were in Nice. I don't know if you were in this session, but they were talking about how Baldwin, he lived in St. Paul-de-Vence, which is like a medieval town, like a stony town. And they said Baldwin would have dinner parties. And people would come out and they would hang out. And I just read yesterday that Josephine Baker came to his house. So Baldwin was very much, he centered communion, he centered community. And I think that's what we can also learn from Baldwin, is sort of like ensuring that, we're all protected. And they also refer to Baldwin's house as almost like a sanctuary in the sense of like people will come over and they'll fellowship and they'll break bread. And to think that, and Baldwin said, Baldwin, how do you, it was something I was reading along the lines of Baldwin was questioned, how do you get your work done? And he said, in order for me to, the mode for my work, in order for me to do the work that needs to be done, I have to be in community. I have to actually, and so Baldwin he wasn't as maroon as people think. He actually had a sense of community.
Yeah, and I love that we brought that up because, I mean, one, I do a lot of YouTube videos and I've been doing a lot of James Baldwin videos, and I actually did a video recently where I tried his writing routine.
At night.
And basically his writing routine was he'd wake up around noon, gab with his friends, or no, he would do some work earlier in the day a little bit, and then a friend would come over and they'd talk until like dinner, and then more people would come over, but then by then he'd already be drinking and smoking cigarettes, and then he'd go to dinner and then bring people back and they'd hang out, and usually he'd start working again intensely around like midnight or 1. And I tried that for just 3 days. It involved a lot of Black Label whiskey, which and so I also mentioned that because I think even that experiment where I was stepping into his shoes, I was like, I'm definitely freelance, I'm definitely self-employed. I like this schedule in certain ways, but there are other things like waking up at noon, I don't understand. And so, yeah, I think it's also just a testament to how intensely he lived and how there was a good and bad. Because like just reading like different biographies about him, there's some biographies where he's like, I literally had to leave New York in order to escape all the fanfare that people would bring my way. But then also he'd maybe like stay somewhere in like, I don't know, Switzerland or wherever he'd stay, and it'd be quiet for like a week or two, and then he would just invite random people. And I don't know, there's this one story I read in one of his biographies where I think it's by David Lemming, which was Baldwin's assistant for a few years, where basically Baldwin's sister visited him in Saint Paul de Vence, and Baldwin had so many different kinds of people, all kinds of riffraff showing up, that his sister mentioned like she was so stressed that she started losing her hair, and then she had to leave. So there was also that impact. Yeah. And so I think when you look at him, like that intensity for living is like there in all parts of his life, even in terms of like how he drank or how he engaged in movements or how he would kind of turn towards different points of his identity and different points in his career. I think he was very passionate about the way he expressed himself in his life, and that is also something that I think a lot of young people need, or especially when I was in my early 20s, I really needed, because you grew up in a world that in many ways is very anti-Black. And then, I'm thinking of like the James Baldwin quote where he's like, you grow up with all these heroes and the cowboys and the Indians, and you get to a certain age and you realize that you are the metaphorical like indigenous person, the Indian. And so I think he was also living so intensely, because I also wonder, and this is a big part of what I'm trying to write towards in terms of like a collection of essays about Baldwin now, like I'm very interested in the emotional reality of his life, both the isolation and the hyper intercommunalism, the ways that he bared witness, and also how people who were in movement spaces around him thought that bearing witness wasn't enough. And so I think the image of Baldwin that we have is beautiful and amazing and important, but I also think when I read into him, I recognize even like a lot of the loneliness I've experienced in my life in certain ways because of my Blackness and my queerness. And I don't know, I feel like that's a part of his legacy life that I want to see more of. Because there's so many ways that he could be co-opted now.
And I've thought about sort of Baldwin's emotional state, because Fire Next Time came out in 1964, and Baldwin at that time, he was like the spokesperson in context of the civil rights movement. In fact, Baldwin, he never intended on being a spokesperson. I mean, he was an arresting communicator when it talks about like racial horror and racial politics, but Baldwin, it's almost like he almost reluctant to actually be sort of that figure. But something interesting happened. So the civil rights movement started in mid-1950, so 1954. Baldwin sort of became famous with Fire Next Time. He became sort of like the key prolific spokesperson. And then King died in 1968. And that's it's 1960.
What year did ML?
It was April.
Was it 1960?
April 1960. Am I right? Yeah. So and that's when sort of the civil rights movement sort of like almost obliterated. Like it dwindled away. But Malcolm died that following year, which was 1969. And Baldwin said, and he was asked, why didn't you just get away? He's like, I'm better than that. But also you have to understand, like I'm writing between assassinations. And Baldwin had a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow. He never expressed being in despair, but he always described himself in rage, rightful rage. So I also think about sort of like, how did that sort of impacted his writing? And in fact, Jamaica Kincaid, in the book I suggest to you to read, God Made My Face, she talks about, which is interesting, that she believes Baldwin's main impulse was to be a novelist. He was known for his essays, but she said because of the racist pressure of that time, that a great novelist was not allowed to be. So I'm always thinking about Baldwin in that context of like, Baldwin feeling like he couldn't be in that sense, and he carried a lot of grief.
Yeah.
Have you paid any attention to that or noticed?
Yeah, I mean, you recommended God Made My Face to me, and I read it. I think I was reading it when I was like filming the writing routine. Some stuff in that book where I was like, oh Lord, somebody get Baldwin a therapist. But
Because he was depressed too.
Yeah. I mean, the way I view that is I was like learning about the fact that I believe it was in the early 70s, that Baldwin was hired or took on the job to write a biopic screenplay about Malcolm X's life. And how, like, or I can't remember when exactly it was, probably late 60s or early 1970s. But basically, while he was writing that, MLK, I believe, was killed because he basically talked in like some kind of interview where he was like doing an interview about writing the film while he was at a hotel in California, and then they received the news. And I think to your point about when he, like, if anyone's seen the documentary Meeting the Man, I think that's when he says, like, I'm working in between assassinations. They're killing my friends for no reason. And so I view the disillusionment of how the civil rights movement ended as like a big break in his willingness to participate in the public in a certain way, his willingness to write about things in a certain way. I think those assassinations broke him in a certain sense. And I also think since the movement fell apart and the people that he considered comrades or allies who, could recognize him and resonate with him, those people were dying off, and then it became this super macho black power, how big can your muscles be, how strong can you be after solitary confinement, and I don't think Baldwin wanted to engage in that on a like a toxic masculinity kind of way. And so I view the later kind of, at least creative nonfiction writings of Baldwin as like him trying to reassert his space within like blackness as a whole, and also trying to, reorient himself in a world that in some ways you can view like the civil rights movement as this kind of hopeful movement and the Black Power movement as a more offensive or rage-filled one. And I think when you look at Baldwin's like writing or his ability to speak, he could bring that love, but he could also bring the rage. And it came out for different reasons. And yeah, I mean, he tried to write that Malcolm X script, and then eventually he was like, screw this. And then I think he went to Turkey, and then even there he got beaten up by a group of people. So it's like, oh Lord, like where can you go to safe? What does he say? Nowhere. And so I really think about, and I just look at the world right now, and I'm like, it's not like I can compare right now exactly to the 60s and 70s, but I'm like, racial unrest and reckoning, anti-war movements, environmental movements arising, deep-seated fears about fascism and movement repression. All of those things are kind of happening now, and I'll bring this in. Like, I do a podcast with my co-host Jordan Mays, and we talk about Black anarchism and different topics. And we recently interviewed a former Black Panther Party member, and I kind of said to her, I was like, oh, like, what do you what advice do you give to young people who are in movements and you're trying to be in solidarity with people, but they might be more scared of certain things related to the state, and it puts people at risk in terms of like state surveillance? And I think what makes me respect Baldwin and also the lives that we're living and how we're trying to show up is this former Black Panther Party member said, like, I'll tell you when I find out. And they said, like, if I can look at the issues that we fought against, we built a mass movement, mass mobilization around a series of configurations and revolutionary like processes. And still, in her perspective, in many ways, she was like, police brutality is worse now. The militaristic funding is worse now. The way the mainstream media lies on movements and spreads propaganda is worse now from her perspective. And I think that's subjective, but I think even in that sense, like it is our duty to continue his legacy and to go beyond it. Yeah, and I feel like maybe to that point, like I guess something I think about a lot is like Baldwin's notion of bearing witness and how I think there are both really good and amazing elements to that, but I think for me as like a grassroots organizer, I almost want more from him in that sense. And so I guess I wonder about, like, I guess what's your perspective on his kind of notion of bearing witness, and I don't know, I guess how you feel like that shows up in the world today for you as like a Black person, an artist, an educator. During
Yeah, I do quite a bit of research on like Baldwin as the witness, and as you all know, Baldwin was a witness to the things he to the things he's seen. He testified to the things he's seen, to the things he felt. Baldwin talks about the sort of distinction between being a witness and being observing, and he believes that being observing means just being inactive, but being a witness means I was there and I testified to what happened. I always referred to Baldwin as a great documentarian. I felt like Baldwin gave us a sense of like sustenance into understanding, like, okay, let's face our personal selves, our personal history. I think his witness also was grounded in the sense of like reckoning with sort of the past with a sense of love, but not love in a sort of like sentimentality sense, but love in a sense of like daring quest. Like Baldwin was really a steward of, I want you sort of to face yourselves, face your personal selves, which this will also incite social transformation, social impact. I think Baldwin had a wonderful way, or marvelous way, of really letting everyone in. And I think it was almost like, with all his mixed, beautiful genres, I felt like everyone had sort of like entry into sort of Baldwin's mind. Because when you saw Baldwin, it's like, how do you know me so well? What's actually happening to me? Right? I think Baldwin wrote this sense of like, on an interior level, and Monty Perry refers to him as like the interior genius. Like, I think everyone, if you read his work, there's a sense of you. It's like when Baldwin says that actually means a million of other people, you know? And I know personally for myself, in terms of witnessing, I feel like I get to witness myself, and I get to ask myself, I get to wrestle with my own personal challenges, and I think Baldwin led a lot of people, though I personally feel like, and I've heard this sort of argument that Baldwin went to the South, but after sort of being distant for so long, and he's talking about, you know, the segregation, but he's like in France writing his novels, but it's like Baldwin said he had to actually come. But Baldwin's analysis, I think it does sort of incite this sense of like, okay, I feel like I'm a part of this movement. I feel like I want to actually like incite social transformation. I actually want to see like my part. And maybe that might just be sort of like really acknowledging, you know, myself. And you know, I know you guys have been seeing it on YouTube. It's sort of this famous sort of statement of like, you know, love has never been a popular movement, and no one has ever wanted to be free, right? And this world, you know, it's held together by the love and the passion of very few people. Yeah. And I think when you listen to stuff like, then he says like, you know, that monster, that police officer, it can be you. Yeah. And I think sort of Baldwin, sort of like the way he's sort of his system of thought and how he's able to sort of like deconstruct, you know what I'm saying, racist practice, you really start to like analyze your choices. Yeah. And it does feel like a sense of like, I see myself, I'm re-seeing myself. And I think there's liberation in that. And he doesn't invoke fear, he invokes liberation through your mind. So I feel change personally. I'm compelled to wrestle and accept and acknowledge myself, and I think that's what sort of Baldwin opened at that door for.
So you're kind of saying, in a sense, for you, bearing witness is the capacity to like look at oneself clearly enough and honestly enough, and then that allows you to do the same for the world around you.
Yeah, I think it is sort of being in tune with your innermost self.
Yeah.
And knowing that your innermost self does have impact with the world around you.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to think of like our own definition of bearing witness, because if I'm thinking of how I take it in the most powerful way, and I'm thinking of my first book, like I think in that book, one of the big themes was if you love someone, you're willing to share their reality with them. You don't abandon them in their truth or their reality. And I think that's what America has done to Black people, Indigenous people, poor people, basically. It's like, here's your dream, and then we'll abandon you. And you might hear from us every 4 years. And when I think about bearing witness and doing it really powerfully, or bearing witness in a way that is also making a demand, it's saying like, I'm going to get close enough to you to be able to see the truth of what we share together. And that truth may be difficult, it may be something that you don't want to admit or I don't want to admit, but something has to bring that to the surface. And I think what he kind of argues too is like we have tools at our disposal, and for him, his tool was like spirituality, language, debate, community. But if you look at all of those parts of his life, he was constantly trying to challenge people or trying to make himself more legible to a world that he knew wanted to destroy him. It already tried to destroy him in countless ways. And so when I think about bearing witness, I think about like, and maybe some of that is like the queerness element of like some of the trauma of how I came out and having a difficult family around that was, I realized like, I don't know if people love me unless they're willing to face my reality with me, even if it isn't exactly the reality they believe in. Like, some people in my family's culture believe being gay is a choice, and so they're like, you chose that reality and I don't need to face it. But I think when I've seen my family change or people change in my life around it, is they acknowledge my reality and they acknowledge that it's something that, not that I deserve to live in, but they honor the fullness of it. And I think that is kind of what Baldwin was demanding of himself and of the world and the people around him through his literature. And especially like I think about like his debates and how funny and sassy or weird he was, but yeah, I take it in that way.
And I agree. I do think there's a sense of like a lot of Baldwin's work had a lot to do with the difficulties of finding love and holding on to love. And I think love is very much central to Baldwin's canon of work. And he talks about love all the time.
Yeah.
And as we know, Baldwin, he says, I desperately wanted to be loved.
What's your top 2 Baldwin books? Top 2.
I don't want to offend nobody. No, I'm just kidding. My top 2, Go Tell It. Go Tell It. By the way, all that happened in one day. The book, like, everything's happening in one day, which is just crazy. And I have to say, Another Country.
Why Another Country?
I don't know. I feel like when I read Another Country, I like inhabit another country. I feel like I was in it. Again, I don't know. When I feel like when I'm reading about Rufus. But by the way, I love how Baldwin is like an autobiographical writer. There's fragments of him everywhere. So I feel like, again, in some ways, I feel like I identify with Baldwin in a lot of ways. So I feel like when I'm reading Baldwin, I was reading Another Country, more was being revealed about myself. Baldwin's very vulnerable. I'm very vulnerable, you know. Baldwin is very sensitive. I'm very sensitive, you know, and I feel like Baldwin had a lot of remembered trauma, and I feel like I've had that experience too. So I feel like I was being healed as I was reading Baldwin, Another Country. And you know, it's just, I love the everyday in the life of Baldwin's work. Like, I think Baldwin does a really good job of sort of writing to the ordinary person. You know, like lighting a match on a grill is powerful for Baldwin. Like he highlights the nuances, the mundane, it makes me realize that every moment has essence. So Another Country, it was really, it was also a really difficult book to read because the main character, Rufus, I hate to spoil it for you, he does commit suicide. And I had a grandmother who committed suicide, and he jumps off of a bridge, and my grandmother jumped off a bridge, so it allowed me to sort of face sort of that trauma and try to almost have language for my grief. So yeah, Another Country is certainly that's dear to me. What about yourself?
Well,
Oh, you wanna say
also, do you
something?
know like some of the story behind Another Country, like who the character of Rufus was based on?
So it was based on his
friend Eugene Worth.
Eugene Worth,
Yeah.
who, yeah,
Yeah, also died by suicide.
Suicide.
Yeah, and I think in that way, like, I don't know, I'm fascinated in the ways that I read more about Baldwin, the more I'm like, I don't know, and I think this is true for every writer. There's a major piece of you in every book, but in Go Tell It on the Mountain, you're like, oh, this is about, you say it's not about you, but oh,
It is about
what do
you.
you think? And then Another Country, in some ways you can see, I think he's grappling with a lot of the different kinds of people he was around and who he was engaging with, and kind of, I don't know, like all of the different sexual and romantic relationships in that book. And then even Giovanni's Room, like I was reading about him, and I think it was in God Made My Face, but like how James Baldwin had his own Giovanni who
Yeah.
like locked him away in a room, and I'm like, dang, like where's your happy book? Where's your happy book? Yeah, and I guess I don't. I also like Another Country, but I find it really difficult to read. 'Cause
It
I'm
is.
like, ooh,
All of
this
them are.
is sad.
all of them are. They're all sad. They're all sad.
But I mean, I guess to what my two favorite Baldwin books are. I mean, I easily always say Giovanni's Room. I read it once a year probably because I feel like it's a master class in a lot of different things, and I love the sense of surrealism in the book. And I also think in an interesting way, a lot of Baldwin's books about love are, it's either like there's a lot of it is I feel like cautionary tales about love, or what happens when we don't fail to meet the demand of love or the complexity of it. Because he has a conversation with Maya Angelou, I think, and they talk about, he says like, if you can't, or maybe it's, I can't remember if it was Maya Angelou or Nikki Giovanni he was talking to, but he basically says like, if you can't love anybody, it makes you dangerous because you're not accountable to anyone. And I think throughout his literature, you can see that thread. But I mean, Giovanni's Room definitely, and then I feel like I really like The Devil's Hands Find Work.
Devil Finds Work?
Yeah, The Devil Finds Work. Just because I enjoy, I don't know, like the range of things he talks about in there, and I like, I don't know, reading some of his later voice. I find it to be really, really interesting. But I don't know, I kind of like the more, I don't know, I also love the Malcolm X screenplay he wrote, because that was eventually published, and it's called One Day I Was Lost. And I feel like it's just so weird and cinematic, and I don't know, I almost want to watch a bunch of the movies that he liked to kind of be like, what? Yeah, but I think those two are the ones that come to mind. But easily the top one is Giovanni's Room, because even though it is a cautionary tale, I just find it so, I don't know, like something about that book is just weird, sad, intense, like very longing in a certain way. And yeah, I think it helped me when I was first like, I might be in love, I'm afraid. And I was like, okay, I'm not gonna end up like these people in this book.
Do you want to take a couple questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Does any-
Yeah.
So, to get us started, I guess I'll ask, instead of your favorite book, what book would you recommend for someone who hasn't read Baldwin before? Is there an entry point that you think kind of opens his work up a little bit?
I mean, I feel like Go Tell It on the Mountain is, I don't know, interesting and beautiful, and I feel like in terms of, I don't know, I guess, like, I think of that because it's like a younger Baldwin in a way, and that feels like an introduction, but, I mean, I think he's known more for his essays, and so if someone gets The Fire Next Time, I also feel like that seems like a very good entry-level text in terms of his overall bibliography.
Yeah.
My question is, since Baldwin lived so intensely, did he have a life partner, or was there no room in his life for a life partner?
He had people. It didn't.
He got around.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm thinking of like what I remember of his biography, I know around the time that he was in Paris in his early 20s, there was a woman that he dated that he mentions that they were considering marrying each other. Then he threw her wedding rings into the Hudson River. And when he was in France, like his first number of years, I think within his first year, he met, like I guess the partner that a lot of people know of, like his name is Lucien Happersberger, I believe is his name. He was a painter. And then he had like other flings, but I feel like
I don't know. He dated a lot of bi-curious men, and sometimes that worked out for him, and sometimes it was hard.
but I think he struggled a lot, and I mean, I think a very sad thing that I think about in the way that he passed away from, I believe it was stomach cancer, but I know in reading his David Lemming biography, like when he was really sick and near the end and kind of in and out, he mainly wanted men to care for him, to bathe him, to feed him. And so I think the way I read that is like he still always had a kind of underlying longing for someone to be in his corner in that way romantically.
And I also know that his picture book, Little Man, the illustrator, I can't remember his name, but I do know that also that the illustrator was also influenced by Buford Delaney. And Buford Delaney used watercolor, the illustrator used watercolor also, but there was, it's in the book I was reading this, mentioned that Baldwin, he wanted to have a relationship. And part of trying to build that relationship was also inviting him to illustrate the book. And that was just one of many of the reasons, but yeah. And
I mean, this is kind of historical tea, but you know they say he was with Marlon Brando. I don't know.
the tea.
Good evening. First of all, thank you for coming. I'm over here.
Oh.
And thank you for representing brothers in the literacy business. Okay.
The literacy
it's a business, right? I have a question, twofold. You said, is your book based on, it's a children's book, right? That's coming out? So I wasn't quite sure how you said you were going to focus it on children. You know, obviously he was unapologetically himself, which is a good point to teach kids. But how, like if you had a room full of kids,
Yeah.
in this grade, at that grade, I'm not sure what grade level would be.
Yeah.
How would you discuss Baldwin to them?
I'm more so focused on his affinity for language.
His
So
what?
his affinity for language.
Okay.
So Baldwin, he was the eldest out of 9. And so Baldwin describes himself as, I read anything, he would say, I read anything I could put my fingers on. You know, Baldwin was a caregiver. He describes Nelson native son that he'll have one sibling one hand and a book in the other. He was a voracious reader, right? Baldwin didn't go to college.
Right.
But Baldwin also made a statement that he had some underlying insecurities about that, believe it or not. But his facility of language came out of reading. So I always talk about sort of the importance of reading. He said, in order for me to enter any building in the world, I have to go to the Harlem Library and read every single book. And he described himself as reading every single book. So I'm more so centered on sort of like Baldwin's relationship with reading. Like the first line is the first time when James Baldwin read a book, the words clung to him like glitter. I want kids to see the possibilities for their own literary lives, right? I want them to know that they have value, that literally their life has value in literature, right? And I think that is important because Baldwin really loved to write as a child. He wrote the school play, right? People don't know that. He was the editor of the Maggie Pod, right? So Baldwin's relationship with reading was, in fact, he didn't perform well in history. I mean, he didn't perform well in science or math, but part of him, and he actually graduated late because his grades were so marred, but part of him being able to graduate was his sort of editorial contribution to the Maggie Pod magazine, right? So I think, and then know that he didn't go to college, and he became he's like a literary giant, right? So kids need to know that about Baldwin's life.
Right. That's a good point. I didn't know about him. So he was self-taught. He's pretty much an entrepreneur.
And he also, he credits his sort of his facility with writing as being nurtured through him being a book reviewer. His editor, he worked for the PM magazine, and he describes his editor as throwing books at him, hurling books at him, and almost challenging him to be able to not only read the books, because he read a lot, but to be able to articulate the books. Right. So he wrote voraciously. He was like an editor, not an editor, a book reviewer.
Also childhood preacher.
How did I forget that? Which the Christian church catalyzes writing. He talks about, although Baldwin, again, he critiqued the limitations of, he perceived as limitations of the church, his church experience, his pulpit, I always say Baldwin left the pulpit to preach the gospel. But his aim was more so centered around the civil rights movement. But Baldwin he was a preacher, and he was a famous preacher, actually, at that time.
He did it to compete with his dad.
He did, because his dad was so demanding.
Yeah.
And his dad actually didn't want him to read anything but the Bible. It was almost like a way for him to sort of, said, like, to take my power back, I have to become a pastor, do what he's doing. Yeah, so just the writing. If you read the school journal Star Review, it says something along the lines, and I agree. It's like it's also important for the craft of writing for kids to know like what's possible when they decide to like write it down.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. You had a question, Alex?
Okay, so my question is kind of twofold. First off, y'all are fabulous. Thank you for your brains. But
my wife is my stylist, by the way.
Shout out to the stylist. But I wanted to know, so I guess it's kind of two questions, but I wanted to know, because both of your perspectives come, I guess, from a different aspect of James Baldwin to me, but I want to know, what did getting to know James Baldwin teach you about yourself? But I also want to know, what did getting to know James Baldwin teach you about God and like spirit and that?
You can start.
Yeah, those are amazing questions. Oh, Lord, it's been one of those weeks. I mean, I would say, oh, Lord. I mean, I would say being gay and black, growing up in America is hard. And I think just like James Baldwin had to go out into the world, be challenged by it, be messed up by it, make mistakes, experience a lot of messy things, very far away from what he considered his home, and how that is both something that's extremely isolating, but also something extremely empowering. It can help you figure out who you are outside of all of the projections onto you that the world has. And I feel like he's helped me understand, practice, and defend that part of myself. And understand, like, even when the world messes me up, I'm going out there to find something, to learn something, to engage with something, and to know the world in a deeper way. And I think he demanded that of himself and of the people around him and the ways that he challenged them. And I really, really respect that. And I feel like he gave me an example of that, and I feel like I'm finding my own version of it every day. And then what he's taught me about like God and spirituality, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, as a political and radical person who's been like a grassroots organizer for like 10 years, I think there are a lot of rightful reasons to be cynical. But maybe it's like the Black liberation kind of theology that I admire about like Black history and how that has helped and moved so many people, is that I think he was really a big fan of, I don't know, like, it's important that we do the right thing anyway. It's important that we bear witness anyway. It's important that we show up and be an example of this better world that we want to live in. And I think that's tied to his love of God and spirituality and this deeper humanism that I think the world tries to rob from us. And so in those ways, I think his spirituality gave him this gift of propheticism where he could hold like both his anger and his love at the same time. And I don't know, a lot of that I think is like how I look at God or how I feel about God or spirituality. Like, I think there's a lot of violence there and a lot of violence that exists in the world, but also, I don't know, the more spiritual side of me is like, it's not just one or the other, both kind of exist. And I don't know, to me, Baldwin really represents that. Like, he's such a hope-giving person, but his life was also really messy, and like, he got arrested in Paris for like some bed sheets and had a lot of suicidal ideation and was sleeping with who I think were a lot of the wrong people. And I'm like, who? Lord. But you gave a lot of people hope. So I feel like, but I feel like I appreciate that, because it's almost like he respected himself as like an imperfect vessel in the eyes of God, and I think we can all do that with ourselves and each other as well, while challenging people.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Baldwin is someone, because he has such a complicated nature. I think a lot about sort of his position in the church. Again, he was a pastor for 3 years. But he stepped away, and I feel like, and he was still preaching the gospel. He fellowshiped with the marginalized society. I think Baldwin also talks about, like, I don't care what church you go to. If you're not, he said, I get my commands from Jesus. If you're not loving anybody, I don't care what church you go to. You know, if you're not feeding the sick, I don't care what church you go to. If you're not going to the prisons, I don't care what church you go to. And he always held on to sort of that sort of the doctrine of love that is at the heart of the Christianity faith. And he always said, keep the faith. But Baldwin was also, he never went into despair in spite of sort of the racial horror that he was up against. He always talks about, we can't afford to be in despair. We have too many children. We can't tell the children that there's no hope, right? So he always had this perpetual hope. And again, love was always it was always at the center of his work. If you read his work, he's always referencing love. And I like to think of myself as a loving individual, or at least I try to nurture that side of me. And I feel like I can look to Baldwin as sort of like a representation of what love looks like in its complexity, right? Love is not, it's hard, it's a quest, it's daring, it's facing yourself. Love it reckons with the past, so I'm very much feel like, I don't necessarily have to be in the church day by day in order to sort of feel like I can help liberate and have an impact. Literally, our world matters too. Yeah. And I think Baldwin, that's what it was. Baldwin recognized, he didn't want the world to just diminish. He really wanted the world to sort of be renewed through love. Yeah. He always talked about the New Jerusalem that he was working towards, So I'm always thinking about Baldwin's sort of, his sort of biblical nature and how that translated in his writing. Good question, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Two more questions.
Thank you so much. I was reflecting on, the perfect segue is this idea of he would have the anger and the justified anger and rage, of course, but God love him, the best of him would get him back to the center of his compass of unconditional love. And when I unconditionally love people as well as myself, then I am in a better place to speak the truth, look for the truth, look beyond the misgivings of what other people are doing, and still know that there's goodness in them somewhere, even though they're acting like crazy from hell right now. So with that, I wanted to say, he's passed on, but these are his works. This is his legacy. And we are challenged in the society right now with these movements to have a lot of things that just certain groups don't like removed from our libraries, removed from the schools. And I am looking for ways, and I would invite everybody to, and see what you might think how we could move, because Jimmy would want us to take action, to be the witness, but when you can, speak up, speak out, take action, of making sure the great legacy he left, as well as other works. I was shocked when I heard that some of our greatest literature is being now questioned to have it removed from libraries and removed from schools. Do you know of anything going on or ways you plan to participate to make sure these great works, his works and others, will be out there and available, and we can work together to not have them taken out of our libraries and our children's schools.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think there's a lot of different ways I look at it. I mean, I think one, we're currently in a period of time where I think a lot of the politics that we're experiencing and intaking is geared towards the national and the federal, but there are always local elections, local issues that we can like power map and understand and target. And I feel like some of that is like, one, in James Baldwin's example, like we need to be in deep community with each other so we can understand what the issues are, we can talk to our neighbors, we can talk to our friends. And so there's that element of it, because I think we live in a political system and an economic system where isolationism, individualism is so preached and pushed. And then I think like power mapping our own communities, so looking at the people in your city council or your school board or whatever institutions are in your community and studying those people, researching them, being specific about the ways that we think that they're faltering and the ways that they're doing right or wrong. And if we have that level of commitment to holding our local institutions accountable, we can begin to be on the path towards like, I don't know, having communal power as opposed to an institution dictating that power down to us. And then I think like when institutions fail us, just like many movements of the past have taught us, like I believe that it's our responsibility to resist. So if these books are taken out of schools, how are we disrupting the political processes or the institutions as they're going as normal? And I think that can look like disruption, that can look like spreading consciousness, getting more media attention on things. But yeah, I don't think, just like anything, I don't think it's a one-size-all-fits answer, but I think we deserve to use a diversity of tactics, and we also deserve to resist when I believe that the state will inevitably fail us. And that's just where I'm coming from. But yeah, and I think that also to me looks like anti-fascism. Yeah.
Well, Prince and Quartez, thank you so much for this discussion. This was wonderful. Thank you everybody for coming.